Hello, friends and neighbors, and welcome to the poem of the day for today, Saturday, October 18th, 2025. Happy Saturday for everyone. I hope that you are able to take a restful and reflective day today. It's raining here. It's been raining all day. I think it's going to rain all day into the evening, maybe even into the night. And it was something that we've needed in this area for a while because we haven't had rain in quite some time. But it's also, I think, an invitation to stay inside and take a slower day, a more intentional and lazy and reflective day. There's a certain privilege, not privilege. What's the word I'm looking for here? Permission. There we go. That the weather gives us on days like this, which is to say, go ahead and slow down. You don't have to go out and run around and do everything, or I'll even feel guilty sometimes not getting outside on beautiful days. And so a day like this sort of says, you can sit this one out, which is nice. I'm taking a little bit of a break just in this series, just because things are quite busy for me at the moment. And so I'm glad to be back today. I had kind of a break in the day where I thought I was able to do this. I'm also going to take a little bit of a break here from the Poe, and instead we're going to do a little bit of a one-off here of the poem The Death of a Toad by Richard Wilbur, which comes from 1950. And I'm going to be asking shortly my students to take a look at this poem and work with this poem. At least I'm thinking about that. And I've read through it a few times, and it's a heavy poem, and it's a poem where the simple action of something that might go unnoticed for the rest of us in our normal and day-to-day lives is put under a microscope and then sort of extrapolated into something that's far bigger and more tragic than it might initially seem. So this is Death of a Toad by Richard Wilbur from 1950. A toad the power mower caught. Let me try that again. A toad the power mower caught, chewed and clipped of a leg, with a hobbling hop has got to the garden verge, and sanctuaried him under the cineraria leaves, in the shade of the ashen and harp-shaped leaves, in a dim, low, and final glade. The rare original heart's blood goes, spends in the earthen hide, in the folds and wizenings, flows in the gutters of the banked and staring eyes. He lies, as still as if he would return to stone, and suddenly attending, dies toward some deep monotone. Toward misted and ebullient seas and cooling shores, toward lost amphibious emperies. Day dwindles, drowning, and at length is gone, and the wide and antique eyes which still appear to watch across the castrate lawn, the haggard daylight steer. So this poem, at the beginning, I think seems very difficult and almost impenetrable because of the very specific and loaded diction within it that makes the imagery feel not imprecise, but maybe a little bit impenetrable at the beginning. So I often like to look at the form of the poem and to try to see the way in which the form of the poem guides us to pay attention to particular things. So in this case, I notice off the bat that there are 3 stanzas, 6 lines per stanza, making for 18 lines. Each stanza has an irregular line length or an irregular meter to it, but they do each share in the consistency of the rhyme scheme, which goes A, A, B, C, B. So you're hearing caught, got, him, shade, dim, glade, and then that continues throughout the rest of the poem. And I think other interesting thing about it is that structurally, upon initial glance, is that the first stanza ends with a period, as though kind of wrapping up an image or an idea, whereas the second and the third are joined together by a comma. And so there's a sense in which, just glancing at it that way, the third stanza is going to be a continuation of what is brought up and discussed in the second. At least that's what it looks like on first glance. I've also noticed that the first and the third stanza have more alliteration in them than the second. So in the first, we get chewed and clipped of a leg. So that's actually consonants in there. With a hobbling hop has got. And so you're hearing the hobbling hop has. You're also hearing those low O's. Hobbling hop has got. So we have an assonance in there. We might also notice then in stanza 3 that we have day dwindles drowning, for example. And so there's more of a distinct sonic quality to the first and third stanzas than we might hear, at least on first read or first glance for the second. And then if we just consider what is actually being described in this poem, what's happening. And within the first line, we get the main action of the poem, which is that a toad, its leg got clipped pretty severely by the blade of a lawnmower. And something that I think is notable about this is that there's no human described in the poem. The perpetrator of the violence or the action of the cutting is described strictly as the power mower, focusing us on the object, the machinery itself, and not on the person who is pushing it. There's no sense in here that the frog is being chased. The toad is being chased. The toad is being trying to get away from a person. There's no talk about footsteps or anything like that. There's just this kind of disembodied mower that is that heartlessly and indifferently clipped and chewed its leg. So then the toad has this hobbling hop, and it goes further into the garden under the scenario leaves as a sort of sanctuary, a place to hide, and to find safety in there of not sort of being seen. And animals often do this when they are injured or sense that there's death on the way. And what's described there is afterward, there's that low and final glade, right? So we have at the end of the first stanza, the toad waiting underneath the leaves, kind of, we can imagine, although this is not in the poem, examining the wounds, tending to the wounds, considering the wounds. And so that leads us into the second stanza, which is what the toad sees or recognizes. But again, this is described really objectively from the perspective of a narrator. We don't get this anthropomorphizing of the toad itself. This is almost like a kind of David Attenborough documentary look at the toad. The rare and original heartblood goes, spends on the earth and hides. So it's bleeding out. It's bleeding all over the grass and the ground, flowing into the gutters of the banked and staring eyes. So the image given here is the toad, sort of the blood draining out of its face, right? And its eyes kind of going still and staring. And in this moment, if we as readers want to anthropomorphize, it seems as though this moment right in the middle of the poem is the moment at which the toad has a recognition of its own death coming, trying to see whether it lives and dies. He lies still as if he would turn to stone, and soundlessly attending dies towards some deep monotone. And I think the deep monotone is interesting because it leaves us on this note that there's kind of a low hum, which I think could still be the hum of the mower. So the toad is dying to the sound of the hum of the mower. And he's also talking about being turned to stone, which sounds almost mythic, right? Like looking back upon the burning city. Was it Nineveh or Sodom and Gomorrah in the Bible, which turned people into stone? And so there's this sense of, to look back and to have some sort of regret at the destruction is this thing that's going to immobilize and drain the life out of the toad. But also the idea that once a body dies, it turns hard, with rigor mortis there. And there's the deep undertone of the atmosphere, but the toad itself dies soundlessly, unseen, unheard, and it gradually just wastes away. But here's where we have, again, these two stanzas, though separate and broken, joined by the continuation of the description of some sort of like afterlife for the toad, though the toad is not really mentioned again, because the sentence goes on into the first two lines of the next stanza. Toward misted and ebullient seas and cooling shores, toward lost amphibia's emperies. And you'll notice amphibia is capitalized. And so there's this really beautiful, peaceful, kind of celestial requiem that occurs in these two lines. That the toad dies attending to the seas, the shores, almost in this kind of beach-like area. And amphibious emperies. For me, that just feels like he's going towards the empires of all of the amphibians, and that he's going sort of into this afterlife and this kind of paradise of the other world to be with the other toads who have also gotten struck by lawnmowers or died in other ways. Then that's the end of that sentence, and the last four lines then are their own sentence, and they take us kind of back to the scene, back to nature without the toad, without the mower, nature sort of undisturbed. It reads, day dwindles, drowning, and at length is gone. And I think it's interesting there that day then is personified as something that drowns, right? Which recalls for us the ebullient seas. To say that seas are ebullient is to invest them with a human emotion, one of a lot of joy and energy, jubilance, exuberance. But day is dwindling, and it says at length is gone in the wide and antique eyes. So we're at night, and then we have these wide antique eyes, which to me recalls the eyes in the middle of the poem that the toad is staring out, kind of on this verge between life and death. So day at this time is again in that verge between turning into night as day is expiring. And so what Wilbur's doing, I think, with those two images of the wide eyes staring is placing us within this kind of liminal state of transition between day and night, between life and death. And then to continue, which still appear to watch across the castrate lawn, the haggard daylight steer. And so there are these eyes that remain watching as the daylight goes by, the daylight, which itself is also described like a human. At the end of the day, we might describe ourselves as haggard from a long day's work. And another interesting adjective in here is the castrate lawn. Castration is the cutting off and the removal of something, but specifically, this can't be referring to the leg of the toad, because I think a more precise word would be like amputation. And castration usually has a connotation of the removal of male sexual organs, for example. And to talk about the lawn as being castrated is particularly evocative, because you could think of, does this make all the blades of grass then phallic, and then the mower is the thing that cut them? Or is it simply taking away, because the backyard, the yard, is now kind of a graveyard or the scene of a crime? Is it taking away the possibility for it to be characterized by giving new life, by being verdant, by being wild and shared with and ingratiated with nature? And so what that part makes me think of within the rest of this poem is the way in which we as humans interact with what we see as being wild, and our need, desire, intention to tame it. When we have yards, we often, we have boundaries, whether we distinguish them or not with fences. We have property lines. This is mine, that's yours. Shouldn't really cross your neighbor's yard unless you have a good relationship with them, right? And then we do certain things, like you might set a stone path, so you have to clear the grass out. And we're coming in and saying, though nature placed grass here, I don't want grass here anymore. This is where I want the stone path. We mow the lawn, right? And if you don't, you get in trouble with your HOA. But that also is kind of an act against nature's will. Nature wants the grass to grow unimpeded. Otherwise, it would have some sort of corrective measure itself, unless you think about like deer eating the grass or something like that. But then we cut it and shape it into something that we think looks nicer. And we think of it as kind of taking care of or curating the space. But what we're not paying attention to is the way that disturbs all the other life underneath. And that's not just the grass, but also in this case, the toad. And you'll notice the mower never stopped. Nobody attended to the toad. No, there's no human in here to go, oh no, I struck this toad. There's just the indifference of humans' intervention into nature for the sake of, in this case, I'm guessing, obligation or aesthetic attunement, but is something that actually disturbed and vanquished this innocent natural life that was really, truly more at home in that space than we are, despite the fact that we think that we own spaces. And that's something that I think that this poem really calls us to consider, is one small example, but writ on a larger scale through the loaded diction in here about empires and seas and cooling shores and day dwindling and all of that. The way in which, in small ways, we impede upon and force ourselves upon the beautiful, wild, untamed will of nature. And because we think that something is wild and untamed, we think it messy, and we think that it calls for our need to bend it to our will. This is written in 1950, and we've only thought about this, I think, more and more as humans have harvested and exploited natural resources. But Wilbur is getting us to think about it in just the simplest ways in which we disturb natural life through what we think are common means of existing. This poem is not about dumping oil into the ocean. It's not about industrial waste. It's about mowing a lawn. I think it makes us think about those things that we do unconsciously that are disturbances and are potentially destructive. And when you look at them rendered through a poem, or when you look at them from the perspective of the toad or amphibia's emperies, it becomes something much more like a cataclysm or a catastrophe or an invasion than it is something to us, which is probably just a Sunday afternoon obligation to mow the lawn so that the neighbors don't get upset. I'm not sure that Wilbur would tell us, don't ever mow lawns anymore. I think he wants us just to think about the ways in which we've placed ourselves in charge here, and that there are consequences to this that not only do we want to think about, but we often don't pause to even consider or to take into a part of the bigger picture. They're out of sight, out of mind, under the leaves, just sort of waiting to die there. Very thought-provoking poem, and one that, again, I think is, through its diction, gets to these larger questions and these larger themes. This has been one of my longer videos, which I think speaks to the richness of the poem and the ideas that it provokes and engenders into us. I also just wanted to spend some more time being kind of slower with this one since I've been away for a while. But thank you for joining me again. I hope to be back soon. Until then, be well, keep reading. May peace be with you.